Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2017 version of SU Research Day. Here at Salisbury University, we really value the contribution of our faculty and their scholarship, and we appreciate you being here. This is our 5th anniversary of SU Research Day, so we're really happy about that. Glad to see students in the audience. This is the first year we've reached out to students and you've showed up, and I'm sure none of you are getting any extra credit whatsoever for being here, and that's why you're taking notes even as I'm just doing the introduction. I'm sure. But we're glad you're here and we hope you get a lot out of it. Want to say thank you to our interim provost, Dr. Karen Olmstead, for being here. She's always a great advocate for research, for students, faculty, everyone on campus, so we really appreciate her efforts and time and energy, and thank her for being here. I'd like to thank everyone who is participating between 5 and 7. We're going to have a reception as well to talk about the importance of mentoring. So all these fine faculty that will be giving their talks are also dedicated to helping mentor students, and we really appreciate their efforts on behalf of our students as well. Our first presenter is Dr. Suzanne Osman from the Psychology Department, and the title of her presentation is Research and Mentorship in Understanding Sexual Aggression, Rape, Empathy, and Acknowledgement. Suzanne?
Thank you, Dean Griffin. I'd also like to thank Dean Pearboom for inviting me here today to represent the Fulton School, which includes a broad range of disciplines from the arts and humanities to the social sciences, all of which engage in student mentorship. But I'm in psychology, as was just said, so I'm going to share some highlights from my primary program of research in understanding sexual aggression, and I'll share some of the research that my students have been involved in. I'm certainly honored to be speaking on a research day that is focused on celebrating student mentoring. So my professional story and my journey as a mentor started back when I myself was a student, first as an undergraduate. I did have opportunities. I was very fortunate to have opportunities to work on research projects with a couple of first-rate mentors. And I know that those experiences were very helpful when it came time for me to get accepted into graduate school. So I know how important research experiences are for my students who aspire to go to graduate school. And I should maybe mention that the psychology department here does not have a graduate program, so all of the students that I have mentored have been undergraduates. And so working with me has usually been their very first experience doing any kind of research. So when I started my graduate program in social psychology, truthfully, I don't think that I fully grasped how important research was in the whole training process. I had started graduate school at a very young age. Many of the undergraduates I was supposed to be teaching were actually older than me. So I was probably a bit naive and kind of lost in my first year regarding research. I did have a faculty advisor who had invited me into the program to work in his lab within his area of expertise, but something wasn't quite clicking for me with research. So I think it was in my second semester that I decided by chance to take an elective course in the psychology of sexuality. And to fill a requirement for that course, I had written a research paper on the topic of belief in token resistance to sex, or the belief that women sometimes say no to sex when they really mean yes, which has implications for rape and sexual assault because the research shows that the large majority of individuals who say no to sex actually do mean no when they say it. But that was that. I didn't think much more of that paper as just filling a requirement for a course until the professor for that course asked to speak with me about it. He said that he thought the ideas in the paper were good and that I should consider developing them and actually going ahead and conducting a study. He said he'd be happy to help me with it, and he suggested that I could do this as my master's thesis, or I could just do it as a project on the side. That wasn't too hard of a choice for me. I figured if I'm going to do this, I might as well make it my master's thesis. And I felt really encouraged. So I made the switch. That professor, Dr. Clive Davis, not the record producer, but the social psychologist, he became my primary advisor. He introduced me to the fascinating field of sexology. I had taken an undergraduate course in human sexuality, but it wasn't until this moment with Dr. Davis that I really understood that scientifically studying sexuality could be my career track. And so he helped me to begin my broader research program in the area of understanding sexual aggression, which you can see kind of happened by chance. So I'm so thankful to him for his encouragement and his mentorship. Without him, I really don't know what direction I would have taken. And so I'm keenly aware of the impact that one mentor can have on a student. And one thing that stands out about my experience working with my mentor is that I never felt that he was helping me in order to advance his own career. He was there to help me advance in mine. And that's one thing that I do hope my students feel about me. I also tried to emulate the intensive individualized mentorship that I received. So my approach is typically to work very in-depth and closely one-on-one with my students, who I also hope are very motivated by true interest in the research, because in addition to working with me as research assistants, they also go ahead and conduct their own independent empirical projects. And this year's theme, focused on student mentoring, led me to reflect back on my research program and realize just how much my students and their interests have influenced the directions in which my research program has branched out over the years, to include the two concepts that I've decided to share here today: rape empathy and rape acknowledgement. You see, my research program in understanding sexual aggression started out examining related attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions, with the hope that this would lead to a better understanding of the thought processes and social patterns that could lead to sexual aggression, which of course is a prevalent problem that we face in society. But it was actually by working with my students on ideas for their student-led projects that I first got introduced to the concept of rape empathy, which is the ability to deeply understand the perspective, emotions, and reactions of a rape victim or perpetrator, to really be able to identify with somebody who has had that experience. I saw that rape empathy was conceptually related to token resistance and other rape ideologies that I had studied. For example, in the case of token resistance, let's say a man misinterprets a woman's message. If he believes that her no means yes, then it stands to reason he cannot really understand her perspective or adequately empathize with her. So this is what led to my student Erin Oken's project examining hypergender ideology and rape empathy. If someone adheres to hypergender ideology, then they believe that real men need sex and they may obtain it aggressively if they need to, that women should use their sexuality to please men and maintain relationships with them. So if this is one's belief structure, then sexual aggression may be viewed as more acceptable by these individuals, and they should be less likely to be able to empathize with a victim. Erin was actually one of my first students to publish her work. And I should maybe take a moment to explain that in the field of psychology, traditionally, the goal is to disseminate our research through presentation and then publication in peer-reviewed journals. So typically, my students will first present their studies, like at the Salisbury University Student Research Conference, which does hold a place in my heart after serving on the committee that runs that conference for 6 years and chairing it for 3 years, which was a lot of work, but rewarding, because that conference truly is a wonderful day of celebrating student research on our campus. My students have also presented off campus, like at the National Conference on Undergraduate Research or at professional conferences in psychology, sometimes supported by internal grants that they've earned. But then, whenever possible, I encourage my students to work toward publication in peer-reviewed student or professional journals, which is often required that they continue working with me after they've graduated, because typical research in psychology is a long process. So for example, from extensive literature review to hypothesis development, to ethics training and study design, to the process of getting approval from an institutional review board to conduct research with human participants, to data collection, processing, analyzing, and interpreting, and then to the dissemination of the results, which again typically includes conference presentation. But if possible, I want my students to experience the entire scientific research process, from the very beginning when their ideas are first conceptualized to the very end, which again traditionally is publication. But of course, seeking publication alone is a very time-consuming process. So I've been very lucky to work with very motivated and some amazing students, including Erin. And it was working on this publication with Erin. This was the point at which rape empathy started to become more of a focus of my research program, because I noticed in the literature that there were some problems with the scientific measurement of it, and it had been identified in the literature as an important factor in sexual aggression. So, for example, empathy with a victim has been related to students' and jurors' rape trial-related judgments. It's been found that perceived empathy among police officers is associated with victims being more likely to take their cases to court. It's been identified as a key component in the treatment of sex offenders, as a key component in rape prevention education programs, and it's been negatively associated with rape supportive attitudes, as Erin's project supported. So as you can start to see, I thought the more we learn about factors that can impact empathy, the more we can inform so many efforts in different areas. And that can now also include contributing to the 2014 federal initiative to better address sexual assault on college campuses. Now, long-standing theoretical discussions on empathy suggest that perspective taking is greater based on similarity to or familiarity with another person's situation. So it's not surprising that those who report personal sexual victimization experiences tend to report greater empathy with victims than those without such experience, and those who report perpetration experiences will report greater empathy than those without such experience. And this is what led me to start incorporating the measurement of actual sexual aggression experiences into my research program. It's also been found consistently that women score higher on rape empathy for victims, and men score higher on empathy for perpetrators. And all of these findings have been supported in some of my students' work as well, including in studies conducted by Erin, Ann Lana Briggs, and Ruby Orth. But this gender difference has often been attributed to the greater prevalence rates of female victims and male perpetrators, suggesting that, therefore, men can more easily understand perpetrators and women can more easily understand victims. But in many of the studies that found these gender differences, personal sexual aggression experiences were not accounted for. And when they were, they largely focused on women with victimization experience. Also, a problem that caught my attention was that the most widely used scale to measure empathy in the literature did so only in the context of a man raping a woman. And we know that both men and women can be victims or perpetrators of many forms of sexual aggression, including rape, sexual assault, coercion. So I did a study in which I examined empathy based on the gender of a hypothetical victim and perpetrator, and participant gender, and personal sexual aggression experiences, and my results were consistent with cultural expectations that women are victims and men are aggressors, because generally speaking, results implied that female perpetrators and male victims need to be better understood and taken more seriously. But results of that study also supported this notion that similarities in experience can increase empathy. So just for example, it turns out that real male victims can empathize just as much as female victims when they're given the opportunity to empathize with a male victim. And with regard to the gender differences that have been found in the literature, my research studies suggest that these gender differences are more elusive among individuals with no sexual assault experiences. And so it seems that it's real experiences that seem to be fueling the gender differences. So for example, in another study that I did, it wasn't just being a woman that was associated with greater victim empathy as compared to being a man, it was being a woman and a victim. But the main reason that I conducted this next study was to address another bias that I had noticed in the literature regarding the measurement of empathy. Although it's estimated that at least 80 to 90% of all victims know their assailants, there seemed to be a bias toward stranger rape. It's not explicitly stated, but a lot of the scale items would refer to things like police and rape court trials and media press coverage, all of which are much more likely in stranger rape cases because stranger cases are more likely to be reported. But results were again consistent with the notion that similarities in experience will facilitate empathy, because those who had been victimized by an acquaintance reported greater empathy than those who had never had this experience, but only when measured with an acquaintance rape victim, not when measured with a stranger rape victim. My students have also conducted studies that have found support for this notion that similarities in experience can increase empathy. So for example, in this study just published, Ruby Orth and I found that committing rape most clearly increases identification with a rapist, as opposed to committing other types of sexual assault. And Lana Briggs and I found that it's the experience of being raped that most clearly increases identification with a rape victim, as opposed to experiencing other types of sexual assault. But then the question came to me, how much can a rape victim empathize or identify with another rape victim if they don't identify as having been raped themselves? This question came to me from my research into the actual sexual aggression experiences that I was measuring. As I learned more and more about that, I started to understand more and more about the concept of rape acknowledgement, which is the second concept that I've chosen to focus on here today. So, unacknowledged rape victims are those who report having an experience that fits a legal definition of rape, but they do not label themselves as rape victims. Now, I will note that this has been found in men, but it's been mostly studied in women. This is highly prevalent. Most studies indicate that at least or over half of all rape victims do not acknowledge their experience, and if they do, it might not happen right away, but often occurs at some later point in time. So how can this be? There are many reasons that this might happen. For example, it could be denial. But research has also supported the notion that many unacknowledged victims have experiences that do not match their own rape scripts. So in other words, their own ideas of what rape is supposed to look like. And they do tend to be less informed about sexual assault. So for example, if their rape script involves a male stranger rapist, then they might not recognize that they were raped by a boyfriend. And it has been found that unacknowledged victims do tend to be more highly acquainted or romantically involved with their assailants than acknowledged victims. Unacknowledged rapes, also compared to acknowledged rapes, also tend to be less violent. There is usually less physical force used by the perpetrator. There's usually less resistance from the victim, like screaming, pleading, or struggling. But this is also in part due to the finding that unacknowledged rapes are also more likely due to incapacitation of the victim. So in those cases, one can't resist in those ways, and there's no need for physical force. Okay, so bringing this literature together with the rape empathy literature, I thought, although they may share the rape experience, if unacknowledged victims do not identify themselves as having been raped, then maybe their ability to empathize with another victim may be limited. So I conducted a study, and comparing non-victims with acknowledged and acknowledged victims, actually in 2 different studies, I found that it was only the acknowledged victims who reported greater empathy with a victim as compared to the other 2 groups. So from this, it seems that being raped may not be enough to increase empathy with another victim unless it is acknowledged. Also, consistent with the similarity theme, I tested for other labels in addition for rape. So if the victim did not label themselves as having been raped, did they label themselves as having been sexually assaulted or sexually victimized? But results found that it was identifying with the label rape that had the biggest impact on empathy for another victim and increasing that empathy for another victim. So, my results suggest that acknowledging rape can increase empathy with other victims, which may help strengthen support networks among them and be a good thing. But We need to be very careful here. This does not mean that people should impose their own preferred labels on other women's experiences, because in some cases, labeling may be harmful. First, let me be clear that the empirical data have well established the negative impact of rape, regardless of acknowledgement status. But then, when comparing acknowledged and unacknowledged victims, the literature is really mixed with regard to associated outcomes. So I've seen studies showing that acknowledgement is associated with positive outcomes, like better coping, but it's also been associated with negative outcomes, like greater stigma, feelings of stigma, and confusion. Sometimes you don't see any differences based on acknowledgement status, like for sexual satisfaction, and sometimes the results are inconsistent from one study to another, like for self-blame. So clearly, there's still a lot of work to be done to understand the factors that are interacting and associated with acknowledgement status. So my student, Caroline Merwin, who goes by her middle name Paige, and some of you may remember her as the student commencement speaker this past May, she decided to do a study to look for an interaction between a victim's acknowledgement status and how recently the rape took place, which actually built off the work of a previous student of mine, Ava Carcieri. But the idea with Paige was that if raped in a more recent time period, acknowledged victims may be more likely in the midst of coping with their rape experience, which may heighten negative outcomes relative to other victims. But if raped longer ago, acknowledged victims may have more likely moved further through the recovery process and therefore have better outcomes than other victims. On the other hand, we thought unacknowledged victims may not be able to fully move through the recovery process, and therefore their outcomes would not be based on recency, and that wouldn't make a difference. So Paige chose to test this rationale on body shame. As many of my past students have been interested in studying body image-related constructs, as you can see some examples here. Now, although Paige and I did not find our hypotheses to be fully supported, we did find an interaction. Okay, so we found that acknowledged victims were, if they were raped longer ago, they were better off regarding body shame than if they had been raped within a year. But we did not find this difference based on recency for the unacknowledged victims. So this study is hot off the press this summer, and even though Paige has just started her doctoral program in clinical psychology and is very busy with that, as a student researcher very dedicated to her work, she is still motivated to follow through with trying to publish a second study that we had conducted during her senior year, testing this same rationale on body and self-esteem. So, in my opinion, Paige is truly an exceptional role model for her peers. And by the way, this whole area of research, examining the rape outcomes that my students have been interested in, combined with the literature on acknowledgement, has generally led me to expand my research program to include other health-related correlates of victimization, for example, including sexual satisfaction and functioning. So here's just a very general overview of the directions in which my research program has taken me. And as I said earlier, looking back, I am struck by how much it has been influenced by my students and their interests. So I'm very thankful to have had opportunities to work closely with some exceptional students. And I can only hope that they all benefit, as I did, from having the individualized mentorship that I've tried to emulate from my own experience as a student. And I hope that this presentation has given you a peek at some of my research and some of the research, the mentored research that my students have been involved in, and that we hope to continue and will contribute to future efforts to further understand, build, or utilize empathy in many contexts, such as jury selection, the rehabilitation of sex offenders, the development of rape education prevention programs, and among individuals who may be working directly with victims, such as police officers, medical doctors, therapists, who should perhaps be sensitive to the use of labels on an individual basis as we continue to learn more and more about the process of acknowledgement and its associated factors. And I just thought that I would recognize some of my student mentees from over the years and a couple of local resources as well. Thank you.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Jill.
Great presentation. I wonder what you could share that you've learned through your research that the university could use here on how it is they go about meeting that 2014, you said it, the 2014 federal regulation law or whatever was passed.
And it's very broad. The 2014 initiative, which we hope is going to continue, to really reach a lot of the areas that I've discussed. You know, they want to try to prevent, they want to have justice, they want to also have support. So I can see this being implemented in different ways with rape education prevention or in counseling, but we do need to first test those. So the first step would probably be to test rape prevention programs in the research, utilizing empathy. And that's been done quite a bit, and there is some evidence suggesting that, you know, if you increase similarities, then you can increase empathy. So for example, there was one study showing that if you expose men to male rape, suddenly they can understand the perspective of a victim that's female. And it's also been associated actually with their later behaviors, like confronting rape jokes, for example. But we need to continue testing that. That would be the first step in different prevention programs. And that then could maybe be brought to campus in different ways. I also just wanted to say, too, to educate a little bit, when I'm talking about acknowledgement, I do realize that the way that I've been discussing it is in a sort of a dichotomous way. And that's largely how it's been looked at in the research as well. But I think it's important to understand that the process of acknowledgement, it's becoming more and more clear, is not a dichotomous situation. There can be many places in between. So it's not that you acknowledge or you don't acknowledge. There are also very many people who are somewhere in between where they could be recognizing that label, but also resisting it. And being confused, you know, and somewhere not understanding. And so what may be more important is whether or not there's a general sense of whether or not, you know, they've been wronged, and do they acknowledge that? And that may be what has more of an impact on their well-being and associated outcomes. So I just want to clarify that because it really isn't dichotomous. It's really multifaceted, and we need to do more research to understand the process in different situations.
I just had a question on like the bar graphs you were showing on like the male and female empathy and stuff like that. How did you measure that specifically? Because it was on a scale of like 1 to 5, but how did you determine what that number was and what was the basis on that?
Well, the scale is actually 18 items, and it's a Likert type scale, so it goes from 1 to 5, and so you can divide it to have it more of a smaller range. So the scale, though, actually has 18 items, and you basically have them answer all of the questions and then look for the mean scores and see if there are significant differences between them.
How did you find people who didn't identify as rape victims but were by legal definition actual rape victims or sexual assault victims?
Very good question. So the way that we identify unacknowledged victims in the literature is we use scales and items that do not use the words like rape or sexual assault, but rather we use behaviorally descriptive items so that people can tell us whether or not they've had an experience with those behaviors. So for example, we might ask, have you ever had a man put his penis, or has anyone ever inserted their fingers or objects into your vagina or your anus without your consent by physical force or threat of force? But we do not use the word rape. And then later, we will ask, have you ever been raped? And so if they had responded in a way that indicated that they had had one of those experiences that meets that legal definition based on behaviors, and then later said, no, I've never been raped, then we know that it's an unacknowledged victim, or that's how it would be That's how it would be scored. And if they said yes, then they'd be acknowledged. If that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you for joining us.